A relentless sun blazed above Los Angeles that afternoon, turning every inch of pavement into a shimmering mirage of heat. James Holloway sat in the family courtroom, trying to steady the rapid beat of his heart. The air conditioning hummed, yet the atmosphere felt stifling, as though the walls themselves were closing in. His divorce hearing had been scheduled for weeks, but nothing about that day felt routine. Oliver Brooks, James's 7-year-old son, sat quietly by his father's side, clutching a worn sketchbook against his chest. James glanced down at him and offered a reassuring nod. Oliver's big eyes seemed distant, as though he was trying to make sense of all the grown-up conversations swirling around them. Occasionally, Oliver would open his sketchbook to add a faint line or shape, but mostly he just observed everyone in the courtroom. Vanessa Delgado, James's ex-wife, stood at the opposite end of the room. She was dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit, though there was a slight tremor in her hands each time she smoothed the fabric of her jacket. Every so often, her gaze flicked toward Oliver, then darted away, as if she feared meeting the boy's innocent eyes. When the judge, a stern-faced woman with sharp features, asked to see Oliver's drawings, James felt an immediate knot form in his stomach. Oliver looked up, hesitant, then extended his sketchbook toward the bailiff. The judge carefully flipped through pages of colorful doodles and smiling stick figures. For a moment, James let out a breath of relief. The drawings looked like any typical child's work: houses, dogs, and bright balloons in the sky. Then the judge paused. Her expression changed. James noticed her lips tighten as she studied a page. She turned it so James could see the stark lines of men handing off envelopes and exchanging what looked unmistakably like money. There were scrawled faces in the background, some crossed out, some circled. One figure wore a hat, and another pointed to a large black bag. Vanessa's eyes widened. She tried to step forward. "Your Honor, these are just silly sketches," she said, forcing a laugh that died quickly in the silence. "He's a creative boy, sometimes too creative." But the judge did not look convinced. She flipped through several more pages, each painting a similar scene: furtive exchanges, secretive glances, and an unsettling aura of adult seriousness that no 7-year-old should be able to depict so vividly. James's mind raced. He remembered moments when Oliver would run around the house humming tunelessly, carrying small envelopes that Vanessa handed to him with instructions like, "Give this to Mr. So-and-so at the door." At the time, he had dismissed it as errands, thinking nothing of it. Now it all took on a far darker shape. Clearing her throat, the judge leaned forward. "Miss Delgado, these drawings raise certain concerns." She glanced at James. "Mr. Holloway, do you have any insight into these images?" James swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor. Oliver sometimes draws from what he sees. But I never imagined—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He looked at Oliver, who stared at his feet as though he wanted to disappear. The judge turned to Vanessa, her face grim. "I'm ordering a formal investigation. Until we know more, you are advised not to remove Oliver from the state without court approval. Is that understood?" Vanessa's face paled. Her lower lip trembled, yet she nodded in compliance. Moments later, the proceeding ended and the parties began gathering their things. The judge tapped the sketchbook with a pensive look before handing it back to Oliver. Outside the courtroom, the heat felt suffocating. James knelt beside Oliver, trying to muster an encouraging smile. "It's all right, buddy. Everything's going to be fine," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Oliver nodded but remained silent. In the corridor, Vanessa walked briskly ahead, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, tight with urgency. James couldn't make out her words, but he sensed that this was not a casual conversation. The look in her eyes as she glanced over her shoulder left him with a profound unease. While the judge's investigation loomed over them, a new, more personal dread settled in James's gut. He slipped his hand into Oliver's and felt the boy's small fingers tighten around his. Together they watched Vanessa disappear around the corner, her expression a clear warning that this was only the beginning. 3 days later, James woke before dawn. The heat wave still clung to the city, making even the mornings oppressive. He busied himself preparing breakfast for Oliver. The boy sat at the kitchen table, silent as usual since the hearing. On a normal day, Oliver would have been talking about comics or describing a dream from the night before. But now he simply toyed with his spoon in a bowl of cereal. James's phone buzzed on the counter, the sharp ring slicing through the uncomfortable quiet. A gravelly voice on the other end introduced himself as Detective Marcus Reed. He asked for James's cooperation in an ongoing inquiry connected to the family court's concerns. Although James had never spoken to a detective before, he agreed to meet immediately. Later that morning, James found himself in a small office in downtown Los Angeles, where Detective Reed, a stocky man in a rumpled shirt, led him to a creaking wooden chair. A fan rattled in the corner, trying and failing to chase away the stale air. Reed rubbed the back of his neck. "So," Reed began, tapping a pen on his desk, "these drawings from your son. The judge believes they might be connected to illicit activities. Does that ring any bells?" James thought about the times Vanessa had given Oliver those envelopes. The memory was clearer now, edged with anxiety. Vanessa used to hand him small packages or letters. I never really questioned it. He stopped, feeling a surge of guilt. "I guess I should have." Reed flipped open a folder. "We pulled Miss Delgado's financials. Some large deposits came in from offshore accounts, unusual patterns for someone without a high-paying job." He paused, studying James's reaction. Did she ever mention involvement with any businesses that seemed questionable? James shook his head. "She always told me she was freelancing for a marketing firm. I never checked the details." Before Reed could respond, an assistant popped in to deliver more paperwork. As he skimmed through it, Reed's expression hardened. "We've also got phone records showing frequent calls to a known suspect named Ricardo Vasquez." The name landed like a punch in James's chest. Detective Reed eyed him carefully, then continued, "We're not sure of the extent of Miss Delgado's involvement yet, but we suspect drug trafficking or money laundering. Your son's drawings indicate he may have witnessed exchanges he shouldn't have." James felt a wave of dizziness. He pictured Oliver hunched over his sketchbook, innocently drawing scenes that might condemn Vanessa. Guilt gnawed at him. He left the station grappling with the realization that he was stepping into something far larger than a messy divorce. That afternoon, James took Oliver to school. On the way out, he was stopped by Miss Carter, Oliver's homeroom teacher. She had gentle eyes and a concerned smile. She told James she had noticed disturbing details in Oliver's artwork weeks before, though she hadn't mentioned it earlier because she wasn't sure it was her place. "He's a sensitive boy," she added softly, "very observant." James managed a grateful nod. Hearing that Oliver's odd drawings had been noticed by others only deepened the knot in his stomach. He recalled how Vanessa had minimized everything at the hearing. Still, he wanted to cling to the possibility that there was a misunderstanding. Late that night, James was jolted awake by a phone call. The voice on the other end was garbled, as though coming through a damaged speaker. "Drop the investigation," it hissed. "Stop letting your son draw, or else." Then came a click, and the line went dead. James stared at the glowing screen, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, mixing with the hum of traffic. In that moment, James realized the judge's concern was not just procedural. Vanessa's situation was dangerous, and now Oliver had become a key to uncovering it. With each passing day, suspicion grew, trailing them like a shadow in the unforgiving Los Angeles heat. By the time the weekend arrived, the city's scorching temperatures had hardly relented. The sun seemed intent on burning its mark into every sidewalk and rooftop. James found a moment of calm on the front porch of his home, watching Oliver set aside his sketchbook in favor of building a small tower of toy blocks. In the past, the boy would have eagerly shown off his latest scribbles, but now he seldom even opened the pages. A sudden knock on the door startled them both. Detective Marcus Reed stepped inside, his shirt once again crumpled from the heat. He carried a file brimming with documents. With a quick wave at Oliver, he motioned for James to follow him into the kitchen. James noticed a stern look in the detective's eyes. Reed placed the file on the table. "We've confirmed a link between Vanessa Delgado and a man named Ricardo Rick Vasquez. He's connected to a Mexican cartel operating out of Southern California. We found wire transfers from overseas accounts into Vanessa's name." James exhaled shakily. "So it's true." Reed nodded. "We believe Miss Delgado acted as a courier, but we're not entirely sure how. The part that concerns us most is the potential use of Oliver as an unwitting messenger. Those drawings of his match-known meeting spots, that's more than coincidence." James felt a surge of protectiveness as he glanced at Oliver busy in the living room. "I need to keep him safe." Reed spoke in a low voice, aware of the little ears in the next room. "It would be best if you both entered protective custody. If Rick finds out that Oliver holds evidence, he could become a target. We'll arrange a safe house." That evening, James packed essentials for himself and Oliver. The boy looked perplexed, but didn't protest when told they would be taking a trip for a while. In truth, Oliver seemed relieved to be leaving the tension of the city behind, even if he didn't fully grasp the reason. By nightfall, a police escort led them to a modest apartment on the outskirts of Los Angeles. It had bare walls and only the most basic furniture. Thick curtains covered every window. Days passed with excruciating slowness. James tried to maintain some form of routine, helping Oliver with reading exercises, preparing simple meals, and occasionally trying to coax him into drawing again. But Oliver only picked at his crayons half-heartedly. Each time the door rattled or a car engine revved outside, James's pulse raced. One afternoon, Vanessa showed up unexpectedly at the door. She was escorted by another plainclothes officer who left them in private for a tense conversation. Her face was pale, eyes sunken. She admitted she had lost control over her situation. "I never meant to involve Oliver," she said, voice trembling. "It began as easy money, delivering envelopes here and there. I didn't ask questions. I didn't know how dangerous Rick really was until it was too late." James stood at a distance, crossing his arms. "Then why the calls? Why the threats?" Vanessa lowered her gaze. "Rick is desperate to keep me quiet. He thinks Oliver saw too much, drew too much, and he knows I've run out of places to hide." Before James could respond, the door opened again, revealing Detective Reed. He signaled to Vanessa that her time was up, and she walked out, leaving behind an air of guilt and regret. That night, James tried to soothe Oliver, who woke from a nightmare calling for his mother. James held him close, whispering reassurances until the boy drifted back to a restless sleep. The next morning, Reed called with urgent news. "We spotted Vanessa meeting Rick at a downtown location. She claims she's being blackmailed. We don't know if she's there willingly or under threat, but the situation is escalating." James's throat went dry. He could hear the strain in the detective's voice. "What do we do?" Reed paused. "We keep you and Oliver out of sight. The more Rick's senses were onto him, the more dangerous he'll become." He hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I'm not sure Vanessa has the strength to get out of this on her own." After ending the call, James found Oliver in the bedroom staring at a blank sheet of paper. The boy's hand hovered over the page, unable to commit a single stroke. It was as if the innocence of his artwork had been stolen by the harsh realities swirling around them. James gently ruffled Oliver's hair and guided him away from the desk, hoping that a moment of rest might calm the silent fear in his son's eyes. Yet the tension showed no signs of fading. Each passing hour felt like a drumbeat, warning them that danger was gathering speed somewhere beyond the walls. When James glimpsed the stark, worried look on Detective Reed's face that evening, he knew the unraveling of Vanessa's secret world was approaching its breaking point. Under the heavy cloak of midnight, Los Angeles glowed with an artificial brilliance that seemed to deny the darkness. From the safe house's living room window, James could see the distant sparkle of downtown lights. Sleep proved impossible for him. He sensed there was more to Vanessa's story, more than mere desperation, and it gnawed at him that he couldn't piece everything together. He paced the apartment, finally pausing when he noticed Oliver sleeping fitfully on the small bed in the next room. The child murmured something incomprehensible, possibly reliving the day's uneasy events in his dreams. James's thoughts turned again to Vanessa. He recalled the early years of their marriage, when she would come home with bright laughter and stories of her plans for the future. He never imagined she would fall into such a perilous network of crime. Close to 1 a.m, a soft knock jolted James from his memories. He opened the door to find Detective Reed standing in the hallway, looking more tired than ever. "We brought her in," Reed said, stepping inside. Vanessa agreed to talk, but only if she could speak to you first. Moments later, Vanessa entered, shoulders slumped. Her eyes darted around as though expecting Rick to lunge from the shadows. James gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, hands twisting nervously. "I'll talk," she whispered, "but I need you to understand something. I never wanted this." Reed gave a curt nod and let his gaze drift between James and Vanessa. "Go ahead." Vanessa took a shaky breath. "It started when I lost my job. I got into debt. Rick approached me with an offer to make quick money. I delivered envelopes, no questions asked. It seemed so harmless. Then he insisted I needed a child to hand off packages if things ever got suspicious. Less chance the cops would think a little boy was a criminal go-between. I refused at first, but he threatened me. Threatened Oliver. I was terrified." James felt his blood turn cold. "You used Oliver for those deliveries?" Vanessa's eyes brimmed with tears. "I told him it was just a game. I had no idea Oliver was paying such close attention, or that he'd draw everything. And by the time I realized how deep I was in, Rick had photos, recordings, blackmail material. He said he'd hurt Oliver if I didn't keep doing it." Detective Reed took a step forward, voice low. "Why not go to the police then?" Vanessa's head snapped up. "I was scared, and then the court date came. The judge saw Oliver's drawings. I knew it was all going to unravel. Rick blamed me for being careless, for letting Oliver keep that notebook." James stared at Vanessa in silence. Betrayal, anger, pity, all of it collided in his chest. He glanced at Oliver's room where the boy still slept, blissfully unaware of the confession happening nearby. His mother's face was streaked with tears, and her lips trembled as though she might collapse under the weight of her own remorse. Reed cleared his throat. "So you admit you cooperated with Rick Vasquez, knowing he was part of a drug trafficking organization?" Vanessa nodded. "I did. I told myself it was temporary, that it would end before anyone got hurt." James's temper finally broke. "Oliver was hurt. He's 7 years old, and now he's carrying memories that no child should have. Do you understand that?" Vanessa flinched but did not look away. "I do. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. But right now, Rick won't stop until he's sure Oliver can't testify, even if it's through his drawings." Detective Reed slid a folder onto the table. "We're planning to use Vanessa's cooperation as leverage. We want Rick in custody. If you help us, Miss Delgado, we'll do what we can to reduce your charges." Vanessa's lips parted in a silent exhale. "I'll do whatever it takes." James struggled to quell his pounding heart. He felt torn between wanting to see Vanessa punished for endangering Oliver and acknowledging that her cooperation might save their son from an even greater threat. Reed gave Vanessa a stern look. "We're setting up a meeting. You'll lure Rick somewhere we can control the situation, but you must follow our instructions exactly. No deviations." Vanessa nodded stiffly, her eyes glassy with both hope and fear. "I understand." The detective's phone buzzed, a soft chime that caused them all to tense. He read the message, then looked up. Rick just sent another text. He wants Vanessa to meet him tomorrow night at a warehouse near the old harbor. Says he has one last job for her. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth and James stepped closer, bracing her with a steadying grip. A spark of terror shone in her eyes. He could sense she was on the verge of collapsing. In that moment, he realized the delicate balance they now faced, to catch a criminal mastermind while protecting Oliver and possibly giving Vanessa a chance to redeem herself. Outside, a siren wailed, slicing through the silence. Oliver stirred in the other room, but did not wake. Vanessa closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm afraid," she whispered. James swallowed. "So am I." A hush settled over them, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator. Detective Reed nodded grimly as though bracing for the storm that was about to break over them. None of them could ignore the message they had just read. It was more than a summons. It was a line drawn in the sand. Either Vanessa would walk into the trap the police had planned, or she would flee and leave them all to face Rick's wrath alone. In that suspended moment, James found himself torn between fury at Vanessa and a lingering attachment to the woman he had once loved. He looked down at the folder, aware that every decision from now on could save Oliver, or plunge them deeper into danger. The confession was out in the open, but the price of truth would soon come due. Night settled over Los Angeles with an uneasy hush. Neon signs flickered across the skyline, and distant sirens echoed through the warm summer air. Inside the cramped safe house, James Holloway leaned against the faded wallpaper, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Detective Marcus Reed stood nearby, reviewing strategy notes with quiet determination. Sitting on the edge of a battered sofa, Vanessa Delgado nervously twisted a tissue in her hands, her eyes darting between James and the detective. She'd already confessed to her role in the cartel's operations. Now, she faced a pivotal choice. Reed cleared his throat. "We have to act quickly, Miss Delgado. Rick Vasquez wants to meet you at the warehouse near the old harbor tomorrow night. The plan is straightforward. You show up, our team moves in, but we need to guarantee your cooperation." Vanessa swallowed hard, her voice a barely audible whisper. "I'll do it. I'll follow your instructions. Just promise Oliver will be safe." James observed her from across the room, torn between anger and pity. The confession he had heard hours earlier still rang in his ears. Oliver had been used as an unwitting courier in Vanessa's covert exchanges. The image of his son's detailed drawings, which had exposed this entire operation, weighed on him like a leaden anchor. Reed spoke again, his tone formal. "Once you're at the warehouse, we'll give you a signal. 3 vibrations on your phone. That's your cue to keep Rick in place. Distract him if you can until my officers close in." Vanessa nodded. She couldn't meet James's eyes. He felt a surge of protectiveness for Oliver, yet he also knew Vanessa was risking her freedom and her life to help the investigation. Whether she was motivated by guilt or genuine love for their son, he wasn't entirely sure, but he clung to the hope that her cooperation might ensure Oliver's safety. A tense silence followed. Oliver was asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the plan forming around him. James pushed away from the wall. What if Rick smells a trap? He's no fool. Reed sighed, clearly sharing that concern. "We'll have a tactical team hidden. We can't risk a large presence, or Rick will vanish. That's why we need Vanessa to keep his attention. Once she sees our signal, she stalls him. We move in." Vanessa rose from the sofa, her face wan in the overhead light. "I understand. I'll do what I must." That night, James barely slept. Despite the relative safety of the secure apartment, fear hummed in his veins. He found himself pacing the small living room, replaying the words from earlier conversations in his mind. Rick's threats, Vanessa's confession, Oliver's terrified eyes. Every so often, he'd peek into the bedroom where Oliver dozed fitfully. The sight of his son's tousled hair and peaceful face tore at James's heart. He wanted so badly for the boy to have a normal childhood, one free from the terror of criminals and hidden agendas. When dawn broke, a ghostly light filtered through the thick curtains. Detective Reed arrived with coffee and extra officers in plain clothes. Time seemed to accelerate as they walked through final preparations. Vanessa, looking uncharacteristically pale, nodded at each instruction, reciting it back to ensure she understood. By mid-afternoon, tension crackled in the air. When Vanessa retreated to the bedroom to gather her courage, James took the opportunity to pull Reed aside. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. "What are the odds this operation goes smoothly?" Reed hesitated. "Rick is dangerous. He's been a target for months, but every time we get close, he disappears. If Vanessa can convince him she's still loyal, or at least desperate, maybe we'll catch him off guard." Then, meeting James's eyes squarely, Reed added, "But you need to prepare yourself. There's always a risk." It was the admission James had dreaded. If something went wrong, Vanessa could die and Rick might slip away again. Even more horrifying was the possibility that Rick would come after Oliver, seeing him as the child who'd exposed crucial details through his sketches. James swallowed back a wave of nausea. As evening approached, the sky turned a dull orange. A police van arrived, whisking Vanessa to a designated staging area near the old harbor. James and Oliver were ordered to remain behind under police guard. Sitting on the faded couch with Oliver at his side, James tried to occupy the boy with a story from one of his favorite children's books, but his own voice sounded shaky to his ears. "Dad," Oliver asked suddenly, "where's Mom?" James paused, searching for the right words. "She's taking care of some important things. She wants to make sure we stay safe." Oliver frowned, fiddling with the corner of the couch cushion. "She didn't even say bye." James pulled him close. "I know, buddy. She's doing her best." Hours passed like slow-motion footage, each minute marked by the restless tapping of James's foot against the floor. Occasionally, a radio in the corner would crackle with police chatter. Detective Reed had assured James he'd call the moment they had Rick in custody, but every second of silence felt like a hammer blow to James's resolve. Suddenly, one of the officers guarding the safe house straightened, pressing a hand to his earpiece. He exchanged urgent words with someone on the other end, then turned to James. "Sir, there's been a development. Miss Delgado left the staging area earlier than planned. She's on the move." James stood up, heart pounding. "What do you mean she left?" "She told our team she needed fresh air," the officer explained, voice tight. "Then she just took off in a car. The trackers show she's heading south on the freeway." James stared at the officer in disbelief. A swirling dread took hold. "She's bailing on the operation, isn't she?" He remembered Vanessa's mention of Mexico, how she'd once confided she might try to flee the entire situation. The officer's gaze shifted uneasily. "We're not sure. Detective Reed is trying to intercept her, but if she's meeting Rick alone, without the tactical team, we could lose them both." Oliver looked up, eyes wide with unspoken fear. James clenched his fists, struggling to remain calm. Vanessa's last words echoed in his mind. "I'll do what I must." Had that been the truth, or had it been a farewell disguised as cooperation? In the sinking hush of that moment, James realized Vanessa might be running for her life, and that Rick would be in relentless pursuit. If the police lost track of both, the entire operation would collapse, and Oliver's safety would be in greater jeopardy than ever before. The officer took a step toward the door. "We have to move now. Detective Reed wants you and Oliver relocated until we know what's happening. Pack quickly." James glanced at Oliver, whose trembling fingers clutched a pencil. Without thinking, he scooped the boy into a protective embrace. The nightmare had deepened. The carefully planned trap for Rick was coming undone, and none of them could predict how it would end. Night blanketed Los Angeles in a cloak of neon and headlights, the sprawling metropolis pulsing with restless energy. Detective Marcus Reed clutched his phone in the passenger seat of an unmarked police car, eyes darting between a tracking map and the bright blur of freeway signs. The target signal moved rapidly south, weaving through traffic at high speed. He cursed under his breath. Vanessa Delgado was running, and Rick Vasquez was somewhere behind or ahead of her, determined to keep her silent. At the safe house, James Holloway had been whisked away with Oliver by a team of officers who insisted on relocating them to a more secure location. But James's anxiety only multiplied. He pestered the officers for updates, each new piece of information more alarming than the last. An hour into the pursuit, news broke over the police radio. Vanessa had deviated onto the road leading to Los Angeles International Airport. Reed's jaw tightened. With a terse order, he directed his driver to change course and press the accelerator. He could only imagine the chaos of a confrontation at one of the busiest airports in the world, filled with innocent bystanders. Meanwhile, James sat in the back of a different police car, Oliver huddled close. Through the tinted windows, the city lights streaked past, surreal in their brightness. An officer up front ended a call and turned to address James, his tone urgent. "Vanessa's heading for LAX, sir. Looks like Rick is closing in on her. Detective Reed wants us to get you there safely. He thinks she might try to board a plane with or without Rick's help." A spike of alarm shot through James. "I need to be there," he said. He felt Oliver's small hand grip his sleeve. Within half an hour, they arrived at the outskirts of the airport, a labyrinth of terminals, parking garages, and endless lines of cars. Police vehicles converged in discreet corners, officers in plain clothes blending into the crowds of travelers. The humid summer air pressed down on everyone like an invisible weight. Leaving Oliver with 2 officers, James rushed to find Detective Reed near an arrivals curb. The detective wore an expression of barely contained tension. "She's parked in a short-term garage," he said, scanning the throngs of travelers with narrowed eyes. "Rick must be here too. We saw his car exit the freeway on our overhead camera feed." James craned his neck, searching the sea of faces. How do we stop them without causing a panic? Reed exhaled, scanning the nearby police. "We're trying to keep it contained. The airport is a security nightmare. One shot fired and we could have hundreds of people in harm's way." Then his gaze flicked past James. "Where's Oliver?" James pointed to a nearby bench where the boy stood with 2 officers. Oliver seemed small against the backdrop of hurried passengers dragging suitcases across polished floors. Even from a distance, James could see Oliver's wide, anxious eyes. Before James could say more, a uniformed officer approached, pressing a radio to his ear. "We have eyes on Miss Delgado near Terminal 4. She's alone, looking distressed, possibly heading to the ticket counter." James's pulse kicked into overdrive. Vanessa must think she can catch a flight. Mexico, maybe anywhere. She's trying to outrun Rick. Reed signaled for James to follow him, and they moved rapidly through the swelling crowd. Adrenaline pounded in James's chest, and he had to resist the urge to break into a sprint. At the terminal entrance, an officer discreetly pointed them toward a row of check-in counters. They spotted Vanessa, her hair disheveled and her expression frantic, clutching a small suitcase. She scanned the departure boards overhead. James could almost feel the fear radiating from her. Spotting him, she froze, a flash of complicated emotion on her face. Relief, regret, desperation all at once. James approached cautiously. "Vanessa, what are you doing?" She pressed a hand to her mouth, glancing around as though expecting Rick to appear any second. I thought if I got out of the country, I could leave this behind," she whispered. "Rick wouldn't find me, and Oliver would be safe." Detective Reed stepped forward, voice firm. "You were supposed to meet him at the warehouse. Our team was ready." Vanessa clutched her suitcase as if it were a lifeline. "I panicked. I got a message saying Rick knows about the warehouse trap. If I showed up, I'd never walk out alive." Just then, a loud commotion broke out near the security lines. The crowd shifted like a tidal wave, people stepping back in alarm. James strained to see what was happening. Between the masses of travelers, he caught a glimpse of a tall man wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Although half hidden, James recognized the menacing posture from descriptions. Rick Vasquez. Detective Reed's radio crackled with urgent voices. Rick had apparently spotted Vanessa. In that instant, Rick pushed through a cluster of confused passengers, one hand tucked inside his jacket. James's heart thundered. He grabbed Vanessa's arm and pulled her back while Reed signaled to nearby officers. "Stay behind me," Reed snapped, eyes locked on Rick. A murmur of uncertainty spread through the crowd as some travelers noticed the tense standoff. Rick's gaze flicked from Vanessa to James, a sneer twisting his features. "You really thought you could run from me?" he growled, his voice dangerously low. James felt Vanessa tremble at his side. She opened her mouth to speak, but Rick lunged forward. Before he could lay a hand on her, Detective Reed drew his weapon, shouting for Rick to stand down. Passengers shrieked, scrambling for cover behind suitcases and pillars. In the confusion, Vanessa stumbled backwards, her suitcase clattering to the floor. Rick, seeing the police close in, pivoted, scanning for an escape route. He fired a single shot into the air, causing a wave of panic. People screamed, dropping to the floor or running for the exits. James ducked behind a column, pulling Vanessa with him. He heard the rapid footfalls of officers converging. Through the swirling chaos, he spotted Oliver with the two officers across the terminal. The boy's face was pale with terror. Suddenly, Rick spotted Oliver too, recognizing the child from a distance. He aimed the gun in Oliver's direction, hate flashing in his eyes. But before he could pull the trigger, one of the officers tackled him to the ground. A second officer kicked the weapon aside, sending it skidding across the polished floor. Detective Reed and several others swarmed Rick. Sirens blared outside the terminal as airport police and SWAT-like teams rushed in. Within seconds, Rick was pinned, handcuffed, and cursing in frustration. Vanessa crumpled against James, sobbing in relief or shock. He couldn't tell which. From across the terminal, Oliver began to run toward his father, weaving through the scattered suitcases and trembling travelers. James rushed forward and scooped him up, wrapping the boy in a tight hug. He could feel Oliver's small body shaking uncontrollably. "It's over," James whispered, though the pandemonium around them continued. "It's finally over." Nearby, Rick was dragged to his feet, his cap askew, revealing a furious glare. Blood trickled from a cut on his temple. Vanessa watched as he was led away, her face drawn and hollow. Reed approached, gun still in hand. "We've got him," he said, motioning to the cluster of officers. "And judging by the evidence Vanessa has provided, and Oliver's sketches, this will be enough to take down a big part of his operation." James's shoulders sagged in relief, though his heart still hammered. In the frantic bustle of law enforcement and terrified travelers, he felt an odd calm sink into his bones. Rick had been subdued at last, but the price of this confrontation hung heavily in the air. Oliver's tear-streaked face reminded him that the scars might linger long after the sound of sirens faded. Vanessa stumbled closer, eyes bloodshot. She reached out as though wanting to touch Oliver's shoulder, then hesitated. "I'm sorry," she murmured shakily. James said nothing. He only clung to Oliver, realizing that while Rick's capture ended one nightmare, a new chapter of healing and accountability was about to begin. The story of Vanessa Delgado's arrest and Ricardo Vasquez's capture blazed across headlines the next morning. Every major news outlet seized upon the dramatic standoff at LAX, highlighting the crucial role that Oliver's sketches had played. Images of law enforcement flooding the airport terminals replayed in a loop, accompanied by interviews with shocked eyewitnesses. Inside a quiet holding area at the police precinct, James Holloway sat next to Oliver on a plain wooden bench. They had been asked to stay for official statements, but the wait felt interminable. Oliver leaned his head against his father's arm, exhausted. James's mind reeled with the events of the past 24 hours. Detective Reed emerged from a side office, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he had barely slept. "We're almost done processing the paperwork," he announced. Then he knelt down to Oliver's eye level. "Kid, I know this has all been scary, but you did something important. Your drawings helped us track down some very bad people." Oliver didn't respond. He gazed at the floor, as if any hint of praise or attention was too overwhelming. James ruffled his son's hair. "Thank you, Detective," he said. "We'll cooperate in whatever else you need." A few doors down, Vanessa Delgado sat behind reinforced glass, shackled at the wrists. She had confessed her involvement with the cartel, detailing her knowledge of money laundering routes and drop-off points. In exchange, she hoped for leniency when her case reached court. Still, she faced serious charges: conspiracy, endangerment of a minor, and participation in illegal trafficking. By the afternoon, James and Oliver were cleared to leave. They emerged into the bright sunlight outside the precinct, feeling both free and strangely disoriented. Reporters clamored for statements, cameras flashing and microphones jostling. James shielded Oliver with his arm, refusing to answer questions. All he wanted was a safe place for his son to rest without the glare of public scrutiny. They returned to their original home, now guarded by officers. Inside, everything looked the same as they had left it. The sofa, the half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, Oliver's crayons scattered in a corner, yet the atmosphere felt fundamentally altered, as though the shadows of fear still lingered in every room. Oliver set down his backpack and hovered near his sketchbook, which lay closed on the kitchen counter. James watched him with a worried expression. The boy had once found so much joy in his drawing. Now, that spark seemed extinguished. A couple of days later, a social worker visited to assess Oliver's well-being. She asked gentle questions about his feelings and experiences, but Oliver answered in single words or remained silent. James felt a pang in his chest. The child he'd known, energetic, chatty, always doodling, had retreated inside himself. Still, progress was made. Oliver did not have nightmares every night anymore, and James was fiercely protective, ensuring no one could harm him again. Occasionally, they watched news reports together, hearing updates on the case against Vanessa Delgado and Rick Vasquez. Oliver would grip James's arm, but he never looked away. Perhaps facing the reality head-on was his quiet way of coping. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Vanessa. It bore the jail's return address, and inside was a brief note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. She expressed remorse, apologized for everything she'd done, and swore she had never intended to hurt Oliver. Reading it left James with complicated emotions. Part of him raged at her betrayal. Another part pitied her desperation. When James tucked the note away, Oliver asked, "Is it from Mom?" James nodded. "Yes. She wants us to know she's sorry." Oliver bit his lip, nodding slowly. He didn't say another word, but later that evening, he took a blank sheet of paper and quietly started sketching. James didn't interrupt, only watched from a distance, his heart lifting ever so slightly to see his son attempting to create again. The next day, Vanessa appeared in court for her bail hearing, looking solemn and subdued in her prison jumpsuit. The judge denied her bail, citing her flight risk and the severity of the charges. The cameras captured every moment as she was escorted away, head lowered. Inside his living room, James turned off the television after watching the news segment. He sat on the couch, Oliver next to him. They exchanged a small smile of mutual understanding. Vanessa would be facing the consequences of her choices. For Oliver, there was a tender sadness mingled with relief. For James, there was the realization that they were truly on their own now, free to shape whatever came next. As they prepared for bed, James observed the latest drawing Oliver had set aside on the table. It depicted a simple scene of two stick figures, one taller, one smaller, standing hand in hand under a cloudless sky. James felt a catch in his throat, recognizing the pair immediately. Father and son together in quiet resilience. Several weeks later, the scorching summer in Los Angeles gave way to a milder autumn. The once stifling heat softened into cooler breezes, and a crispness in the air hinted at change. For James Holloway, change was precisely what he needed. He finalized plans to relocate with Oliver to a small town on the outskirts of California's wine country, a place far removed from the big city's chaotic energy. The day of their departure, James loaded a moving truck with boxes of clothes, furniture, and cherished keepsakes. Each cardboard container felt like a chapter of their old life, sealed and ready to be shipped away. Oliver helped by handing him items, occasionally glancing around the nearly empty house with a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. Before they left, Detective Marcus Reed stopped by to give James a final update on the case against Rick Vasquez and Vanessa Delgado. Thanks to Vanessa's testimony and Oliver's sketches, we've made more arrests in Rick's network. It looks like we've dismantled a good portion of their operation, he explained, then offered a slight smile. I'm sorry things turned out the way they did for Vanessa, but you can rest easier knowing Rick won't be back on the streets. James nodded. I appreciate everything you did, Detective. I really do. He extended a hand and Reed shook it firmly. With one last look at the house he had once shared with Vanessa, James guided Oliver into their car. They followed the moving truck out of Los Angeles, the skyline receding in the rearview mirror. When they reached the open highway, Oliver rolled down the window, letting the cool wind tousle his hair. For the first time in weeks, James saw a hint of a smile on the boy's face. Their new home was a small, single-story house on a tree-lined street where oak branches cast dappled shadows across the pavement. The yard was modest, just enough space for Oliver to play if he wanted. As James unlocked the front door, a sense of possibility unfurled in his chest. The interior smelled faintly of fresh paint, signaling a blank canvas for the next phase of their lives. In the following days, they unpacked boxes slowly, finding places for each belonging. Oliver's crayons, markers, and stacks of drawing paper were neatly arranged on a new wooden desk in his bedroom. At first, he hesitated to use them, but one afternoon James discovered him sitting at the desk, pencil in hand, drawing the oak trees that frame their front yard. James approached quietly. "They're beautiful," he said, eyeing the gentle lines Oliver had already sketched. Oliver nodded, a flicker of pride warming his gaze. "This place feels different," he said softly. James took a seat beside him. "It does. It's a chance to start again." He paused, pressing a hand to Oliver's shoulder. "I know the past few months have been hard, but I want you to know that no matter what, we're in this together." Oliver's eyes shone with a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. "Will Mom ever come here?" James thought for a moment, recalling the 15-year sentence Vanessa faced. "She has to stay where she is for now, Ollie. Maybe someday when you're older, if you decide you want to see her, we'll figure it out. But for now, let's just focus on us." In the kitchen, they hung a few family photos, including one from Oliver's earliest birthday party, a snapshot capturing simpler times. James wondered if he was doing the right thing by displaying an image that included Vanessa, but he decided Oliver needed the full picture of where he came from, even if it was complicated. Each weekend, James and Oliver explored their new surroundings, strolling through the peaceful streets, greeting neighbors who waved from porches. Oliver began school at a smaller, friendlier institution, where teachers took extra care to help him adjust. Though he was still quiet, each day he opened up a bit more, sometimes showing his classmates little drawings of the oak trees, the local bakery, or the red brick library downtown. On a crisp Saturday morning, father and son ventured into a nearby park. Golden leaves fluttered down from towering sycamores, carpeting the grass in bright patches of color. Oliver dashed ahead, turned around with a grin, and beckoned James to join him. James jogged over, heart lightening at the sound of his son's laughter, a sound that had been absent for too long. Later that afternoon, they sat on their front porch, sipping lemonade and watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. Oliver pulled out his sketchbook. He glanced at James, who nodded encouragingly, then started drawing a scene of the two of them in the park. This time, his lines were confident and joyful, capturing a father and son united under a clear sky. James felt emotion constrict his throat. He laid a hand on Oliver's back. "You know, no matter what happened before, I'm proud of you. You're strong and you're brave." Oliver looked up, a hint of a smile curving his lips. "We're both brave." They continued to sketch the day's memory together, and in that moment, James sensed that Oliver was beginning to heal. Not forgetting the past, but learning to carry it without letting it define him. He could see the faint lines of worry still etched in Oliver's face, but for the first time in a long while, those lines were overshadowed by hope. As dusk approached, the sky lit up in shades of pink and orange. Father and son lingered outside, admiring the beauty of their new surroundings, content in the knowledge that they had survived a trial that would have broken many. Though scars remained, they had found a quiet corner of the world to rebuild their lives. When the last rays of sunlight disappeared, they headed inside. The warm glow of a lamp illuminated the hallway, highlighting the drawings Oliver had tacked to the wall. Some were from the old days, houses and balloons, but most were new sketches of tree-lined streets and starry nights over peaceful rooftops. James gently placed an arm around Oliver's shoulders. Together they gazed at the gallery of pictures, each image marking a step forward. Beyond their windows, the rustling leaves whispered a lullaby of new beginnings, and for the first time, James felt certain that despite everything they had endured, they were finally on the road to something better.